So if we were to sum up verse 5, it'd be hard for me, it's actually for me to sum up verse 5 any better, but I did take a shot at it, and you may not necessarily like some of my wordings, but here it is, verse 5. I think the summary is that what is the goal? Why should we confront false teacher? Because God wants to produce love that comes from purity, truth, and faith. Purity, truth, and faith. The false teaching doesn't produce that, okay? That's why you need to confront it. That's why you need to nip it in the bud, as Barney Fife used to say. Those false teachers, they do not have a pure heart. There is no purity. They apparently don't have a clear conscience, a good conscience, because they don't know the truth, and they're not acting on the truth, and they're not acting from a sincere faith, a genuine faith. So the goal then is to produce love that comes from purity, truth, and faith. But in case we're wondering, at this point, well, what are these guys really teaching? I mean, we really don't know too much about it. We know myths, so we know that it's fiction, it's made up stuff, and we know something about genealogies, but that really doesn't tell us much. I don't even know what that means, genealogies necessarily. But beginning in verse 6, he actually tells us that apparently these teachers, these are Jewish men. Okay, they have come from a Old Testament Judaism background, and they are apparently teaching that you not only need Jesus to get to heaven, but you need to also obey the law, the Old Testament law. And in this context here, the law that we're going to read about is God's moral law, which includes, by the way, the Ten Commandments. Now, some of you may be sort of surprised at what Paul says here about the law, about the Ten Commandments, okay? But anyway, here he is. This is what they're teaching, beginning in verse 6. And, wow. Verse 6, he says, some have wandered away from these. In other words, these false teachers have wandered away from love. They've wandered away from a pure heart. They've wandered away from a good conscience. They've wandered away from a genuine and a sincere faith. And what are they doing? They have wandered away from these and turned to what? Meaningless talk. I love that word, meaningless. It's total nonsense. It's made up stuff. I mean, it's just total out of their imaginations. It's total and utter nonsense. Don't listen to this stuff, okay? Meaningless talk. And then verse 7, and this one personally makes me kind of laugh every time I read it. I guess I don't know what that says about me, but it says they want to be teachers of the law, but they do not know what they're talking about or what they so confidently affirm. They don't know what they're talking about. And as I was preparing for this message, I was watching a TV evangelist who will remain unnamed, but this guy, I watched about 5 minutes of this guy, and I concluded, oh my gosh, he has no idea what he's talking about. But the scary part, they show a shot of who he's preaching to on a full arena. Oh, these people it's huge. But the guy has no idea what he's talking about. It's meaningless. It's fiction. It's made up stuff. They have no idea what they're talking about. And then, beginning of verse 8, then he says some really significant things about the law. So some of you may kind of be a little surprised by this. Beginning in verse 8, he says, we know that the law is good if one uses it properly. So we know that the Old Testament law is good. And remember, the Old Testament law includes the Ten Commandments, okay? This is God's moral law. We know that it's good provided you use the law properly. And then he goes on to say who the law is actually for, beginning in verse 9. We also know that law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for adulterers and perverts, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine that conforms to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which he entrusted to me. Now, in case you didn't sort of catch what he's saying there, he says clearly, the law, and again, and I'll even be more specific, the Ten Commandments, their primary use is not for the righteous. It is not for Christians. Okay? Its primary use is for lawbreakers, for the rebellious, for the adulterers, for the perverts, for all these people who are hopelessly falling into sin. Now, before you leave here and say, well, Chris said that we're not supposed to obey the Ten Commandments. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the primary purpose is not for Christians. As Christians, are the Ten Commandments still applicable to us? Well, yeah, because God's moral laws, I mean, they're absolute. They still apply to us. But the primary use for the Ten Commandments is not for Christians. It's not for you and me. If you're a Christian, it's not for us. For the most part, it's to convict unbelievers of their sin. So if you're keeping track, that is the purpose of the law. The law convicts unbelievers of their sin. That is why he says, the law is for them primarily, not for those of us who are Christians. And I say again, should we use them as a moral guide? A moral guide? Of course we should. But the Ten Commandments' primary purpose is to convict unbelievers. God wants unbelievers to read the Ten Commandments and say, wow, I haven't kept all those commandments. Well, you know what? As Christians, we've already admitted that, haven't we? And we've already done something about it in our faith in Jesus. But the unbelievers, they need to hear the Ten Commandments so that they are convicted of their sin and they try and do something about it. So the law convicts unbelievers of their sin. Now, at this point, some of your tendency might be, wow, this whole Ten Commandment thing, this whole law thing, kind of maybe surprises you. But remember, let's back off. Let's think about the big picture. What is the big picture? What has he been talking about here? He's been talking about false teaching. So, this is the bottom line. This is the big takeaway from the passage. It's not about what we just talked about, the law, although that is significant. But what I want you to carry with you today, and I just want it to bounce around your head, is that bad doctrine is bad for the soul. Bad doctrine is bad for the soul. It is terrible for the soul. It's insidious. It's like a cancer. Bad doctrine is bad for the soul. And so, I say again, if you came here today and your sort of initial response was, well, doctrine's kind of boring, ho-hum, no, it's not. It's extremely important. Doctrine is crucial to the lifeblood of the church. It is crucial. Because bad doctrine is bad for the soul, really bad for the soul. And so if you came here and you do sort of wish, well, I wish the church was more inclusive, that they're a little more tolerant, they would allow other people to sort of share their viewpoints. Well, think again. I don't mean to be sarcastic. I guess I am a little bit, and I apologize for that. But doctrine is important. Sound doctrine must be preserved. Bad doctrine is bad for the soul. It's terrible for the soul. And if you remember, how is this their false teaching described? Myths. It's made up stuff. And it's also described as meaningless talk. It's gibberish. It's utter nonsense. Why are we even listening? And what does it produce? It doesn't produce anything that God wants to produce. It doesn't produce love that comes from a pure heart, a sincere faith, and a clear conscience. No. And in fact, it produces the very opposite of what God wants to produce.